In 1219, according to multiple Persian chroniclers, the Mongol army crossed into Central Asia and accomplished something that still defies military logic. They annihilated an empire of 5 million people in less than 2 years. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were erased so thoroughly that contemporary accounts describe their sites being plowed with salt. The Khwarazmian Empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of China, simply ceased to exist. Think about those numbers. Historical records from both Persian and Mongol sources document somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 Mongol warriors defeating an empire with potential forces exceeding 400,000. Modern historians analyzing contemporary chronicles estimate hundreds of thousands to low millions killed. The cities of Merv, Nishapur, and Samarkand, among the largest and wealthiest in the medieval world, were systematically destroyed. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented historical sources reveal the most brutal and efficient military campaign of the medieval era. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that changed the course of world history. First, the diplomatic incident that contemporary Muslim and Mongol sources agree triggered this apocalypse. Second, the tactical maneuver that military historians call one of the most successful in warfare. A 300-mile desert crossing that Persian chroniclers described as impossible. Third, the single battle where the tables turned, documented by both sides, and why the victory lasted exactly 1 night before collapsing. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did Genghis Khan's youngest son conquer 3 of the world's largest cities with only 7,000 men, according to modern military historian Karl Sverdrup's analysis? What psychological warfare tactics, documented in Persian chronicles, made entire garrison armies surrender without fighting? Why did the Mongols suffer their first major defeat at the Battle of Parwan, only to completely destroy the victorious army 3 months later? How did one diplomatic execution in the city of Otrar lead to what historians estimate as one of the deadliest wars in medieval history? And why do contemporary sources on both sides describe the campaign's brutality in almost identical terms of horror? To understand how an empire vanished in 24 months, we need to go back to 1218, when a merchant caravan approached the border city of Otrar, carrying silk, jade, and a message of peace. By 1217, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II ruled an empire that made him believe he could challenge God himself. His domain stretched from the river Jaxartes in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south, a distance that would take a fast rider 3 months to cross. According to contemporary geographer Yaqut al-Hamawi, who visited the capital Gurganj in 1219, he had never seen a city greater, richer, or more beautiful. Al-Qazvini, the Persian physician and geographer, described Gurganj as a city surrounded by the attention of angels, represented in paradise like a bride in a groom's house. Muhammad's rise had been spectacular and brutal. When his father Tekish died in 1200, the young Shah inherited a middling Central Asian state. 20 years later, he commanded an empire of 5 million people. He had defeated the Seljuk Empire in 1194, destroying the last emperor Togrul III and usurping the Sultanate of Hamadan. He had crushed the Ghurids in 1215, annexing their Afghan territories. He had captured Samarkand from the KURUK-TAGH in 1207. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, had fallen to his armies. The numbers spoke to unmatched power. Demographic historians Tertius Chandler and Gerald Fox estimate that Samarkand held between 100,000 and 200,000 people. Merv, the so-called Queen of Cities, matched those numbers. Nishapur, renowned across the Islamic world for its learning and wealth, housed a similar population. These weren't provincial towns. These were cosmopolitan centers where Silk Road merchants traded Chinese silk for Persian carpets, where libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, where observatories tracked the movements of stars with instruments that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. But power built on recent conquest carries the seeds of its own destruction. Historian C.E. Bosworth, analyzing the Khwarazmian state structure, described the dynasty as highly unpopular and a focus for popular hatred. In none of the provinces they ruled, he noted, did the Khwarazm Shahs ever succeed in creating a bond of interest between themselves and their subjects. Muhammad commanded vast armies. Sources claim as many as 400,000 troops, though modern historians suggest the realistic number was closer to 40,000 to 80,000 scattered across the empire. But commanding troops and trusting them were different matters entirely. The Shah's relationship with his mother defined his reign in ways that would prove fatal. Turkin Khatun held the title Khudavand-e-Jahan, ruler of the world. She maintained her own palace, her own government office called a diwan, and historian Peter Golden characterized their relationship as an uneasy diarchy. All of Muhammad's orders required her approval before enactment. They competed for control. They vied for influence. The instability this created would be ruthlessly exploited by enemies who understood that divided command meant defeated armies. Muhammad's ambition knew no bounds. In 1217, he declared himself Shah and demanded formal recognition from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. When Caliph an-Nasir rejected his claim, Muhammad gathered an army and marched to depose him. His forces crossed into the Zagros Mountains in winter. A blizzard caught them at high elevation. Thousands of warriors died in the snow. The survivors, decimated and demoralized, had no choice but to retreat. The man who had conquered from the Haxartes to the Persian Gulf couldn't conquer weather itself. But empires built on recent conquest carry another fatal weakness. When Muhammad later passed through Nishapur, according to contemporary accounts, he urged citizens to repair the fortifications his father had broken down decades earlier. Bukhara had been sacked by Muhammad himself only 8 years earlier, in 1212. When the city revolted and killed 8,000 to 10,000 Khwarazmians living there. Muhammad retaliated by executing 10,000 citizens. These weren't loyal subjects. These were conquered populations held down by force, populations who would remember every injustice when the conqueror's power faltered. Muhammad had created an empire that looked invincible from the outside. 5 million people, vast territories, wealthy cities, massive armies. But he'd never faced an enemy like the one gathering on his eastern border. He'd never encountered warriors who valued systematic intelligence over individual bravery, who treated terror as a strategic weapon rather than a battlefield emotion, who understood that divided enemies could be destroyed one piece at a time. While Muhammad consolidated his vast territories, 1,500 miles to the east, another empire builder was watching. And that man had very different ideas about how empires should be built. By 1218, Genghis Khan had accomplished something no steppe leader had ever achieved. He'd turned fractious nomadic tribes into an empire that terrified China itself. The transformation had been methodical and absolute. In 1206, he had unified the Mongol tribes through a combination of brilliant diplomacy and ruthless elimination of rivals. By 1209, he'd conquered the Western Xia dynasty. In 1215, his armies had captured Zhongdu, the Jin capital that would later become Beijing. According to historical records, he commanded between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors, though the exact number remains debated among scholars. What made the Mongol army revolutionary wasn't size, it was organization. Genghis Khan, according to contemporary sources and modern historical analysis, instituted a meritocratic command structure that gave his army military superiority despite not being technologically innovative. The system was characterized by draconian discipline, efficient intelligence gathering through merchant networks, mastery of psychological warfare, and a willingness to be utterly ruthless when necessary. Warriors were organized into units called tumans, nominally 10,000 men each, though in practice these averaged closer to 5,000. Every warrior maintained 3 to 5 horses, allowing the army to cover distances that seemed impossible to enemies accustomed to European or Chinese military speeds. The Mongol composite bow represented the cutting edge of steppe warfare technology. Made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, these weapons could fire 12 arrows per minute at effective ranges that exceeded most contemporary archery. Combined with mounted archery skills learned from childhood, Mongol warriors could deliver devastating firepower while maintaining the mobility that made them nearly impossible to pin down in open terrain. But by 1218, Genghis Khan had added something new to his arsenal: Chinese siege engineers. After compiling information from many intelligence sources, primarily from spies along the Silk Road, Genghis Khan carefully prepared his army for the Khwarazmian campaign. According to the Encyclopedia of Military History, the changes had come in adding supporting units to his dreaded cavalry, both heavy and light. He brought Chinese specialists in siege warfare and construction. These included engineers who knew about gunpowder. Historians analyzing the campaign have documented that the Mongol invasion brought Chinese gunpowder weapons to Central Asia for the first time. Weapons like the huochong, a form of Chinese mortar that could hurl explosive projectiles. But here's what separated Genghis Khan from every other conqueror of his era. He genuinely seemed to prefer trade to war when trade was possible. According to the Persian historian Minhaj-i-Siraj, Genghis Khan sent the ruler of the Khwarazmian Empire, Muhammad II, a message seeking trade and greeted him as his neighbor. Quote, _0 multiple sources, including what historians characterize as Mongol historical tradition, are adamant that Genghis at that time had no intention of invading the Khwarazmian Empire. He was interested in trade and even a potential alliance. The philosophy that would drive the coming campaign, however, wasn't about trade or diplomacy. It was about something deeper in steppe culture. Genghis Khan operated by a code called Achi-Kari-Ulku, literally translated as, quote, 1. The steppe code of justice demanded equivalent response. A gift required a gift, an alliance required loyalty, and an insult required vengeance proportional to the offense. Contemporary sources document that Genghis Khan thoroughly enjoyed exacting vengeance on his enemies when they violated agreements or showed disrespect. This wasn't personal malice. It was cultural imperative. When Muhammad of Khwarazm executed his envoys, the need for vengeance would override all other considerations, including the practical benefits of maintaining peace with a wealthy trading partner. In 1218, Genghis Khan's general Jebe annexed the Central Asian state of KURUK-TAGH. This conquest created a direct border between the Mongol Empire and the Khwarazmian Empire for the first time. Muhammad II, according to the chronicler al-Nasawi, had grown apprehensive about his new eastern neighbor following an unintended earlier encounter with Mongol troops. The speed and mobility of Mongol cavalry had frightened the Shah. He'd witnessed firsthand what these warriors could do. But fear didn't lead him to prepare adequately. It led him to make the catastrophic mistake that would doom 5 million people. Genghis Khan sent a caravan of merchants to Otrar in 1218, carrying goods worth a fortune and a message of friendship. The caravan size is disputed in sources, Some chronicles claim 100 Muslim merchants with a single Mongol leading them. Others state 450. What happened when they reached Otrar, however, isn't disputed at all. And what happened next would unleash one of history's most devastating wars. The merchants never saw it coming. Inalchuk, governor of Otrar and the Shah's uncle, accused them of espionage and had the entire caravan arrested. Contemporary sources from both Mongol and Persian traditions agree on what followed. The goods were seized. Silks from China, jade from Central Asia, precious metals and jewels worth enough to fund a small army. Then, according to multiple chronicles, Inalchuk ordered every member of the merchant party executed. Both Muslim and Mongol merchants died. The governor claimed they were spies. Whether he genuinely believed this or acted from paranoia, fueled by Muhammad's general suspicion of Mongol intentions, remains debated by historians. Genghis Khan, learning of the massacre, did something that reveals the depth of his strategic thinking. He didn't immediately retaliate. Instead, trying to maintain diplomacy according to both Persian and Mongol sources, he sent an envoy of 3 men to Shah Muhammad II. The message was carefully calibrated. Give the Shah a chance to disclaim all knowledge of the governor's actions and hand Inalchuk over to the Mongols for punishment. This was diplomatic protocol. This was offering Muhammad a way out. This was Genghis Khan following the customs of civilized states by demanding justice through official channels rather than immediate warfare. Muhammad II's response sealed the fate of his empire. According to the Encyclopedia of Military History, the Shah had both of the Mongol ambassadors shaved and had the Muslim ambassador beheaded before sending them back to Genghis Khan. Some sources claim 1 man was executed, others claim all 3. But all sources agree that Muhammad then immediately ordered the original merchant party to be executed as well, eliminating any witnesses or survivors. The shaving of Mongol ambassadors represented cultural humiliation. Removing beards was a profound insult in both Mongol and many Islamic cultures. The beheading of the Muslim envoy suggested Muhammad didn't even respect his own faith's practitioners when they served Mongol interests. Why would Muhammad do something this catastrophically stupid? Historians have debated this for 8 centuries. One possibility: he genuinely believed Genghis Khan's trade offer was merely a pretext for invasion and decided to strike first, symbolically. Another: his mother Turkin Khatun, who controlled much of the government, influenced the decision. A third: Muhammad had grown so accustomed to bullying his neighbors that he couldn't conceive of a power that would actually retaliate effectively. Whatever the reason, he had just committed what Genghis Khan considered the ultimate violation. Ambassadors, according to contemporary understanding across Eurasian cultures, were sacred and inviolable. You could reject an embassy's message. You could expel envoys from your territory. You could even imprison them if you truly believed they were spies, though this was rare. But executing ambassadors violated every diplomatic custom from China to Europe. It meant war. Not just war, but war without quarter, without mercy, without the possibility of negotiated settlement. Muhammad had destroyed the very mechanism by which civilized states resolve disputes. Genghis Khan's response was immediate and absolute. Contemporary sources document his mobilization of forces through the summer and autumn of 1219. He designated his 3rd son, Ogedei, as his heir, ensuring succession was settled before leaving on what might be a years-long campaign. He left his general Mokhali in China with forces to continue the campaign against the Jin dynasty. Then he assembled what modern historians estimate as between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors, and prepared to march west across the Tian Shan Mountains into Khwarazmian territory. the Khwarazmian Empire would be systematically destroyed. Not conquered, destroyed. Not absorbed, annihilated. This wasn't going to be a war of territorial expansion or strategic positioning. This was Achikari-Ulku on an imperial scale. Evil for evil, death for death. And Muhammad's execution of merchants and ambassadors was about to be repaid with the deaths of hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of his subjects. By summer 1219, as Genghis Khan's army assembled in Mongolia, Muhammad II still didn't understand what he'd unleashed. He thought he faced a barbarian raid. What he actually faced was the end of his world. Genghis Khan didn't just march to war, he engineered it. Contemporary sources document that he spent the summer of 1219 conducting military maneuvers and arranging provisions, while his spies mapped every road, every river, every weakness in Muhammad's empire. The intelligence network the Mongols had built along the Silk Road now paid dividends in precise, actionable information. They knew which cities were well fortified and which relied on reputations rather than walls. They knew which garrison commanders were competent and which were political appointees. They knew which territories were loyal to Muhammad and which had been recently conquered and remained resentful. The army Genghis assembled was organized differently from his earlier campaigns against the Jin dynasty. According to the Encyclopedia of Military History, the changes had come in adding supporting units to his dreaded cavalry, both heavy and light. The heavy cavalry wore armor, layers of leather hardened with lacquer, sometimes reinforced with metal plates captured from Chinese and Persian enemies. These warriors were shock troops, designed to smash through defensive lines and create chaos in enemy formations. The light cavalry remained the Mongol trademark. Mounted archers who could fire 12 arrows per minute while riding at full gallop, who could feign retreat to draw enemies into ambushes, who could operate independently for weeks without supply lines because each warrior carried dried meat and mare's milk. But the addition that would prove decisive was Chinese siege technology. Genghis Khan used specialist catapult units in battle. Engineers who understood counterweights, trajectories, and the mathematics of siege warfare. Historical analysis suggests these units were used in 1220 in Transoxiana, the region encompassing Bukhara and Samarkand. The Chinese may have used these same catapults to hurl gunpowder bombs, early explosive devices that created fire and fragmentation effects unprecedented in Central Asian warfare. Contemporary sources document the psychological impact of these weapons. Defenders who had never seen explosive projectiles described them as devil's work, as fire from the sky, as proof that God had abandoned them. The strategic plan was masterful in its simplicity and audacity. Genghis Khan divided his forces into 3 prongs, each with clear objectives. His eldest son Jochi would lead the 1st Division into the northeast, attacking along the Sir Darya River and putting pressure on the northern cities. The 2nd Division under the General Jebe would march secretly to the southeast, positioning to form, with Joshi's division, a pincer attack on Samarkand when the time came. The 3rd Division, under Genghis Khan personally with his youngest son Tolui, would move in from the northwest. The 3 forces would coordinate across distances of hundreds of miles, communicating through relay riders and achieving a level of operational synchronization that European armies wouldn't match for centuries. The numbers tell the story of Mongol confidence. Historians estimate Genghis commanded between 100,000 and 150,000 total warriors. A massive force by any standard, but not overwhelming when facing an empire of 5 million people with potential mobilization of tens of thousands of defenders. The Mongols were betting everything on superior organization, tactical flexibility, and the psychological impact of their reputation. They were also betting that Muhammad's recently conquered territories wouldn't fight to the death for a ruler they barely knew and didn't trust. Each Mongol warrior maintained 3 to 5 horses, rotating between them to maintain speed over long marches. The horses themselves were small, sturdy steppe breeds, not as impressive as Persian or Arabian war horses in appearance, but far superior in endurance. A Mongol cavalry unit could cover 70 to 100 miles in a day when necessary, arriving at destinations days or even weeks before defenders expected them. This mobility wasn't just tactical, it was strategic. It meant Mongol armies could appear where geography said they shouldn't be, could strike where defenses were weakest, could vanish before relief forces could arrive. The composite bows that every Mongol warrior carried represented the pinnacle of steppe military technology, made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew glued together and allowed to cure for years. These weapons could shoot arrows through chainmail at 150 yards. Contemporary sources record Mongol archery competitions where warriors could hit targets while riding at full gallop in either direction, shooting forward, backward, or to either side with equal accuracy. This wasn't just skill. This was a culture where every male learned to ride and shoot before age 5, where hunting and war employed identical techniques, where a warrior's identity was inseparable from his weapons. By autumn 1219, the Mongol army crossed the Tian Shan Mountains into Khwarazmian territory. They were outnumbered, according to Khwarezmian sources, by more than 3 to 1 if Muhammad could concentrate his forces. But the Mongols understood something Muhammad didn't. In war, concentration of force matters more than total numbers. And Muhammad was about to make the single worst strategic decision of his military career, a decision that would hand victory to the Mongols before a single major battle was fought. While Genghis Khan's army advanced from the east, Muhammad faced an impossible choice. And the choice he made would doom everyone he was supposed to protect. Shah Muhammad II stood in his palace at Samarkand facing a decision that would determine the fate of 5 million people. He didn't trust his generals. He didn't trust his army. And that distrust would kill them all. Historian Peter Golden, analyzing the political structure of the Khwarazmian state, described Muhammad's relationship with his mother, Turkan Khatun, as an uneasy diarchy. The Khwarazmian nobility and populace were discontented with Muhammad's warring and his centralization of government. Muhammad ruled a vast empire, but he ruled it alongside a mother who commanded the allegiance of some of his most senior commanders and his elite Turkic cavalry divisions. They competed for control. They issued contradictory orders. And now, facing the Mongol invasion, this division would prove fatal. Muhammad had one commander he trusted completely, his eldest son, Jalal al-Din, whose military acumen had been critical in a previous engagement on the Irgiz River. Contemporary sources suggest Jalal al-Din was competent, aggressive, and loyal. But he was one man. Every other senior commander in the Khwarezmian military operated under Muhammad's suspicious gaze. Would they fight for him? Would they retreat to save their own forces? Would they make separate peace with the Mongols? Muhammad didn't know. And because he didn't know, he made a choice that historians still debate 8 centuries later. The chronicler al-Nasawi attributes Muhammad's fear of the Mongols to the memory of an unintended earlier encounter with Mongol troops. The speed and mobility of Mongol cavalry had frightened the Shah in ways that traditional Islamic or Persian armies never had. Muhammad had witnessed Mongol scouts covering distances that should have been impossible. He'd heard reports from Chinese sources about how Mongol armies operated, not with the heavy shock cavalry of European knights or the massed infantry of Islamic armies, but with coordinated swarms of horse archers who refused to be pinned down, who attacked supply lines and command centers, who turned every battle into a chase where the defender exhausted himself, pursuing an enemy who wouldn't stand and fight. Historian C.E. Bosworth analyzed the fundamental weakness in Muhammad's position. The Khwarazm Shahs, he noted, were highly unpopular and a focus for popular hatred. In none of the provinces they ruled did they ever succeed in creating a bond of interest between themselves and their subjects. Many areas that Muhammad charged his troops to defend had been devastated recently by Khwarazmian forces themselves. When Muhammad later passed through Nishapur, contemporary accounts record, he urged citizens to repair the fortifications his father had broken down. Bukhara had been sacked by Muhammad himself only 8 years earlier. These weren't loyal subjects willing to die for their ruler. These were conquered populations looking for any opportunity to throw off Khwarazmian control. So Muhammad made his choice. According to multiple historical sources, the Shah decided to distribute his forces as garrison troops inside his most important towns, cities like Samarkand, Merv, and Nishapur. There was no attempt to coordinate a grand strategy among the various provinces. There was no effort to unite significant forces in one unified front against the invaders. Contemporary sources note that Muhammad claimed to command up to 400,000 troops, though modern historian Karl Sverdrup's analysis of the region's demographics suggests the realistic number was closer to 40,000 to 80,000, scattered across the entire empire. The strategic logic was understandable if you believed you couldn't trust your commanders in open battle. Fortified cities had walls, supplies, and defensible positions. Garrison duty meant commanders couldn't abandon their posts without it being obvious desertion. Each city would fight independently, forcing the Mongols to conduct lengthy sieges, buying time for relief forces or for winter weather to disrupt the invasion. Muhammad, wary of Mongol skill in battle and doubtful of his commander's loyalties according to contemporary sources, adopted what military historians call a defense-in-depth strategy. But here's what Muhammad didn't understand. This strategy handed the Mongols exactly what they wanted. By refusing to meet the Mongols in the field, by scattering his forces across dozens of cities, Muhammad allowed the lightly armored, highly mobile Mongol armies uncontested superiority outside city walls. The Mongols could isolate cities one at a time. They could prevent reinforcement. They could choose when and where to attack, concentrating overwhelming force against each garrison sequentially, while the garrisons in other cities sat helpless behind their walls, knowing they were next but unable to help each other. Contemporary sources record that when the Mongols later attacked Bukhara, most of the Khwarazmian army simply deserted and left the city. The garrison, composed largely of Turkic soldiers who felt little loyalty to the Persian Shah, abandoned their posts. When Samarkand was subsequently attacked, the Turkic soldiers in that city allegedly said of the Mongols, according to historical accounts, "We are their race. They will not kill us." They surrendered after only 4 days of fighting. The pattern repeated across the empire. Recently conquered populations saw no reason to die for a ruler they barely knew, fighting an enemy who might actually treat them better than Muhammad had. By scattering his armies in cities, Muhammad had turned his empire into sequential targets. The Mongols would eat them one at a time, and the first course was already being served. In autumn 1219, Chagatai and Ogadai, Genghis Khan's second and third sons, led their army toward Otrar, the city where this war began, where Inalchuk still governed, where the governor who had executed the merchant caravan was about to learn what Achikariolku meant when applied by the grandson of the great Khan himself. Autumn 1219. The Mongol army arrived at Otrar's walls, and Genghis Khan gave the city one chance to surrender. The garrison's answer was a flight of arrows from the battlements. Contemporary sources record that the siege began in late autumn and would continue through one of the harshest winters Central Asia had seen in years. Rashid al-Din stated that Otrar had a garrison of 20,000, while another chronicler, Juvaini, claimed 60,000 defenders. Modern historian Karl Sverdrup, analyzing the city's size and demographic capacity, contends these numbers are probably exaggerated by an order of magnitude. The realistic garrison was likely 2,000 to 6,000 men. But whatever the exact number, they were about to endure 5 months of systematic, methodical destruction. The Mongol siege technique had been perfected during decades of campaigns against Chinese fortified cities. Chagatai and Ogaday commanded the operation, and they brought Chinese engineering expertise that transformed siege warfare from brutal attrition into calculated science. According to historical accounts, the Mongols surrounded the city completely, cutting off all supply routes and any possibility of reinforcement. Then they began the methodical work of breaking Otrar's defenses. For 5 months, according to contemporary chronicles, Genghis Khan personally oversaw the siege. The winter cold was brutal. Temperatures that made metal too painful to touch without gloves, that froze water in canteens, that killed exposed men in hours. But the Mongols had grown up on the steppes, where winter meant survival skills learned from childhood. They knew how to maintain fires in wind. They knew how to keep horses alive when fodder ran short. They knew how to endure conditions that would break armies from warmer climates. Otrar's defenders held out through techniques that demonstrated desperate courage. They repaired walls at night that Mongol siege engines damaged during the day. They made sorties to burn Mongol siege equipment. They rationed food with iron discipline. Inalchuk, whatever his other failings, proved he could lead men in a hopeless situation. The city withstood bombardment from Chinese catapults. It survived attempts to undermine the walls through tunneling. It endured the constant psychological pressure of knowing that beyond those walls sat an army that had crushed every enemy it had ever faced. But in February 1220, according to historical records, the Mongols managed to storm the main part of the city by entering through a sally port gate that wasn't properly secured. A sally port. A small, reinforced gate designed to let defenders make surprise attacks on besiegers had been left inadequately defended. Whether through exhaustion, betrayal, or simple human error after months of constant vigilance, the oversight was fatal. Mongol assault troops poured through the opening. Within hours, they controlled most of Otrar. The city that had taken 5 months to besiege fell in a single day once the walls were breached. But Inalchuk wasn't finished. Another month went by, contemporary sources record, before the citadel at Otrar was finally taken. The governor and his most loyal troops retreated to the fortified center of the city, the last redoubt, the final defensive position. They had no food. They had limited water. They had no hope of relief. And they fought anyway. Historical accounts describe Inalchuk in the last moments of the siege climbing to the top of the citadel and throwing down roof tiles at the oncoming Mongols. A futile gesture of defiance from a man who knew exactly what awaited him. When the citadel finally fell, Genghis Khan's revenge was precise and symbolic. According to multiple sources, he killed many of the city's inhabitants and enslaved the rest. But for Inalchuk, the governor whose paranoia and greed had started this war, Genghis Khan devised something specific. Contemporary chronicles record that he executed Inalchuk by pouring molten silver into his ears and eyes. A death that referenced the governor's greed in seizing the merchant caravan's silver and gold. A death that matched the crime in the logic of Ashikari Ulku. The man who had valued precious metals more than diplomatic protocol died by those same metals. The execution sent a message that resonated across Central Asia. Resist the Mongols and die horribly. Surrender early and you might be spared. But resist and then surrender? Expect no mercy. Expect creative brutality. Expect to serve as an example that would be discussed in markets and palaces from China to Persia. Otrar had held for 6 months total, 5 for the city, 1 more for the citadel. But the lesson wasn't about the length of resistance. The lesson was about the absolute certainty of Mongol vengeance once that resistance was overcome. Yet while his sons methodically crushed Otrar, Genghis Khan had already moved on to bigger targets. He and Tolui, his youngest son, had vanished into the Kizilkum Desert west of Otrar. 300 miles of trackless wasteland that no army had ever crossed, terrain considered a natural defense that made the western approach to Bukhara impossible. Military tacticians analyzing the campaign centuries later would call what happened next one of the most successful maneuvers in warfare. The Mongols were about to appear where no army should exist, at the gates of one of the Islamic world's greatest cities. And the defenders wouldn't even know they were coming until shadows appeared on the horizon, and the air filled with the thunder of 100,000 hooves. The Kizilkum Desert stretched 300 miles between the Syr Darya River and Bukhara. No army had ever crossed it in force. The terrain was considered a natural defense. Trackless expanses of sand and gravel where water sources were days apart, where summer heat could kill in hours and winter cold in minutes, where even nomads who knew the routes traveled in small groups because large numbers couldn't find enough water to survive. The Khwarazm Shah and his advisors assumed, according to contemporary sources, that the Mongols would invade through the Dzungarian Gate, the natural mountain pass between the conquered KURUK-TAGH territories and the Khwarazmian Empire. All defensive preparations focused on the eastern approaches. Nobody was watching the south. Genghis Khan and Tolui, at the head of an army of roughly 50,000 men, according to historical estimates, didn't attempt to cross the desert in one march. That would have been suicide. Instead, contemporary sources document they traversed the seemingly impassable Kizilkum by hopping through various oases, guided most of the way by captured nomads who knew the routes. This wasn't reckless bravery. This was systematic intelligence gathering converted into strategic advantage. Mongol scouts had spent months mapping water sources. They'd questioned merchants about seasonal variations in spring flows. They'd identified which oases could support how many horses for how many days. The crossing itself was a masterwork of logistics. The Mongol army traveled light. Each warrior carried dried meat and mare's milk that could sustain him for weeks without resupply. The horses were rotated constantly, with each warrior maintaining 3 to 5 animals, so no single horse was ridden to exhaustion. When they reached an oasis, they would rest for a day or two, allowing horses to graze and men to replenish water supplies. Then they would push forward to the next waypoint, navigating by stars and landmarks that the captured guides identified. Contemporary chronicles record that the Mongols arrived at the gates of Bukhara virtually unnoticed. The defenders had no advance warning. No scouts reported a massive army approaching from the south because nobody had scouts watching the south. It was impossible for an army to come from that direction. Military historians and tacticians, analyzing this operation centuries later, regard the surprise entrance to Bukhara as one of the most successful maneuvers in warfare. The strategic brilliance lay not just in the audacity of attempting the crossing, but in the thoroughness of preparation that made the audacity survivable. Muhammad II had made his defensive calculations based on geography. The Syr Darya River line with its fortified cities would slow any eastern advance. The mountains to the north channeled invasion routes into predictable corridors. The desert to the south made western approaches impossible. By the time Mongol armies fought through the eastern defenses, Muhammad would have months to concentrate forces and prepare. But Genghis Khan had just bypassed the entire eastern defensive line, while Chagatai and Ogedei were still grinding through Otrar's defenses in the north. Their fathers sat outside Bukhara in the west, having traveled 300 miles through terrain that was supposed to be impassable. The impact went beyond tactical surprise. The crossing demonstrated something that would demoralize Khwarazmian resistance throughout the campaign. Mongol armies could appear anywhere. They could do things that conventional military wisdom said were impossible. They operated by different rules, with different capabilities, accepting risks that seemed insane to commanders trained in Persian or Islamic military traditions. If the Mongols could cross the Kizil-Kum with 50,000 men and horses, what else could they do? What other impossible attacks might come from directions nobody was watching? Muhammad's scouts reported nothing unusual along the Sir Darya. They were looking east, toward the Dzungarian Gate, toward the logical invasion routes. Meanwhile, death approached from the south, from the desert, from the direction that geography said couldn't support an army. By February 1220, while Otrar's citadel still held out in its final month of resistance, Genghis Khan sat outside Bukhara with 50,000 warriors. The city's garrison had no idea they were surrounded until Mongol cavalry appeared on all approaches simultaneously. The defenders looked at the desert to their south and saw an army that shouldn't exist. 3 days later, one of the great cities of the Islamic world would cease to exist as well. Bukhara sat behind a moat and a single wall, not heavily fortified by Central Asian standards, more a commercial center than a military stronghold. The Bukharan garrison was made up of Turkic soldiers, commanded by officers appointed by Shah Muhammad. Contemporary sources record that when the Mongols appeared on February 12th, 1220, the garrison numbered somewhere around 20,000 men, according to medieval chroniclers. Though historian Karl Sverdrup's analysis suggests the realistic number was probably closer to 2,000. Whatever the actual size, the defenders faced an impossible situation. Surrounded by an army that had materialized from impossible terrain, cut off from reinforcement, defending a city that wasn't built to withstand a serious siege. The Mongol offer was standard: surrender now, and the city would be spared significant destruction. Resist and face annihilation. The garrison commander made a decision that contemporary accounts suggest he immediately regretted. On the third day of the siege, according to historical records, he led the Turkish garrison troops on a breakout attempt. They would smash through the Mongol lines and escape to fight another day. Military historians analyzing the attempt have noted that this wasn't entirely irrational. Mongol siege lines could sometimes be penetrated by determined cavalry charges, and the garrison probably calculated they had no chance defending walls that weren't designed for extended siege warfare. The breakout was completely destroyed in open battle. Contemporary sources record that Mongol light cavalry enveloped the charging garrison forces, firing arrows from all sides while staying just out of reach of the Turkic cavalry's melee weapons. The composite bows that gave Mongols their edge in open warfare. Effective range of 150 yards, firing 12 arrows per minute, turned the breakout into a massacre. Turkic soldiers fell from their horses with multiple arrows through their armor. The survivors tried to retreat back into the city, but Mongol assault forces were already entering through gates that had been opened for the sortie. Within hours, Mongol soldiers controlled Bukhara's walls. What happened next would be repeated at city after city across the Khwarazmian Empire. The population was assembled in an open area outside the city walls. Contemporary accounts from multiple sources record a speech that, whether Genghis Khan's exact words or a later chronicler's embellishment remains debated by historians, captures the psychological warfare strategy the Mongols employed throughout the campaign, according to chroniclers like Rashid al-Din and Ibn al-Athir. Genghis Khan addressed the assembled population of Bukhara and said, quote, "For, whether apocryphal or not," the quote reveals Mongol strategy. They weren't just conquering, they were divine punishment. Resistance wasn't just futile militarily, it was futile spiritually. Your own sins had brought this disaster upon you. This psychological approach, documented across multiple contemporary sources, aimed to break the will to resist before battles even began. If people believed the Mongols were unstoppable instruments of divine wrath, they were less likely to fight and more likely to surrender quickly, preserving their lives and the city's infrastructure. Bukhara was systematically looted, according to multiple chronicles. The Mongols removed everything of value: gold, silver, precious stones, fine fabrics, religious manuscripts that could be sold. The soldiers were killed. Historians documenting the city's fate record that thousands of able-bodied men and women were enslaved and sent east to serve as laborers or domestic servants. Craftsmen, particularly skilled workers like metalworkers, weavers, and engineers, were spared and taken to serve Mongol needs elsewhere. The elderly, the very young, and those with no obvious economic value were sometimes released, sometimes killed, depending on Mongol assessments of whether the population might rebel once the army moved on. Then they burned it. Not every building. The Mongols weren't interested in total destruction of infrastructure they might use, but enough to send a message. Contemporary sources describe the great congregational mosque going up in flames, its wooden roof and decorations consumed while the brick structure remained as a blackened shell. The flames could be seen for miles, a pillar of smoke announcing to surrounding territories that Bukhara, one of the great trading cities of Central Asia, had fallen in 3 days. 3 days from appearance to annihilation. 3 days to demonstrate that geography meant nothing, fortifications meant nothing, garrison size meant nothing when facing Mongol operational superiority. Rashid al-Din recorded that the remaining inhabitants were left without provisions or property, their city stripped of everything that made it function as an economic center. But here's what made Bukhara's fall strategically decisive. It wasn't the city's destruction that mattered most. It was the lesson it taught every other city in the empire. Resist and die. Surrender early, and some of you survive. The Mongols had established a pattern that would be repeated at every subsequent siege. And the next target was already decided. Samarkand, capital of the Khwarazmian Empire, the jewel of Central Asia, sat just 220 miles to the east. 3 Mongol armies, Genghis Khan from the west, Yochi from the northeast, and Jebe from the southeast, were converging on Muhammad's capital in a coordinated operation that would demonstrate Mongol command and control capabilities far exceeded anything contemporary Islamic or Persian armies could match. Muhammad II, sitting in Samarkand's palace, was about to face a decision that would define him historically. Stay and fight, or abandon his capital and his people to save himself. March 1220. 3 Mongol armies approached Samarkand from 3 directions simultaneously, a convergence that required coordination across hundreds of miles of territory without modern communications, a feat that demonstrated the superiority of Mongol intelligence networks and command structures. Genghis Khan approached from the west with the forces that had just destroyed Bukhara. His eldest son Jochi advanced from the northeast after completing operations along the Sir Darya. General Jebe arrived from the southeast, having secretly marched his division into position months earlier. Contemporary sources record that Samarkand's defenders looked out from their walls and saw Mongol standards on every horizon. They were surrounded. Samarkand was no minor commercial center. This was the capital of the Khwarazmian Empire, one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world. Demographic historians Tertius Chandler and Gerald Fox estimate the population somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000. Making it comparable in size to any European capital of the era. The city sat at the crossroads of Silk Road trade routes, where merchants from China met merchants from Persia, where Buddhist monks traded theological arguments with Islamic scholars, where libraries held manuscripts in a dozen languages. The walls were substantial, thick enough to mount defenders, high enough to make scaling difficult, backed by a citadel that could serve as a last redoubt if the outer defenses fell. Muhammad II faced an impossible choice. Contemporary sources, particularly the Persian historian Minhaj-e-Siraj Juzjani, document the exact date of Samarkand's fall as March 19, 1220. But before that date, Muhammad had to decide whether to stay and lead the defense of his own capital, or flee to preserve his ability to raise new armies and continue resistance. The logic of staying was emotional and symbolic. A Shah who abandoned his capital lost all moral authority to rule. The logic of fleeing was coldly practical. If Muhammad died or was captured in Samarkand, the empire died with him. If he escaped, he could potentially rally forces in the western provinces and continue the war. Muhammad chose to flee. Historical accounts record that he abandoned Samarkand before the siege even began, riding out with a small guard of loyal cavalry and heading west toward the Caspian. His mother, Turkin Khatun, remained in the city, along with what sources claim was a substantial garrison. The population of Samarkand watched their Shah disappear over the western horizon, while Mongol armies closed in from three sides. The psychological impact was devastating. If their own ruler wouldn't stay to defend his capital, why should ordinary soldiers risk death? The siege began with standard Mongol tactics. Complete encirclement, cutting all supply routes, preventing any possibility of reinforcement or escape. According to contemporary accounts, Genghis Khan offered surrender terms. The city could submit and preserve most of its population and infrastructure, or resist and face what Bukhara had faced. The garrison commander, without the Shah to provide orders, had to make his own decision. He chose to resist. For 5 days, according to historical sources, Samarkand's defenders held their walls against Mongol assault forces supported by Chinese siege engines. But here's where the ethnic politics of the Khwarazmian Empire proved fatal. The garrison defending Samarkand was composed largely of Turkic soldiers, the same ethnic group as many Mongol tribes, sharing linguistic similarities and cultural connections despite fighting on opposite sides. On the 5th day of the siege, according to multiple contemporary sources, these Turkic soldiers allegedly looked at the Mongol besiegers and decided, quote 5, they surrendered and opened the gates, expecting to be integrated into the Mongol army, or at least spared. The Mongols killed them anyway. Contemporary accounts record that the surrendered garrison troops were executed despite their ethnic connections and their willingness to betray their Persian commanders. This served multiple purposes. First, it demonstrated that Mongol loyalty went to Genghis Khan personally, not to ethnic identity, a point that would be crucial in maintaining discipline in an army that incorporated soldiers from dozens of different tribes and regions. Second, it sent a message that surrender after resistance offered no guaranteed safety. Third, it eliminated potential troublemakers who had already proven themselves willing to betray their commanders. Turkin Khatun, the Shah's mother, who had ruled alongside Muhammad in their uneasy diarchy, was captured in the citadel. Sources differ on her immediate fate, but she survived the initial massacre, perhaps because Genghis Khan recognized her value as a hostage, perhaps because executing the mother of an enemy ruler violated even Mongol customs. She would eventually be sent to Mongolia, dying in captivity and never seeing her son again. Her capture symbolized something larger: the complete collapse of Khwarazmian political authority. The co-ruler of the empire was now a Mongol prisoner. The Shah himself was fleeing west with no plan and no army. The capital had fallen in 5 days. The population of Samarkand suffered the now familiar pattern. Able-bodied men and women were enslaved. Craftsmen were spared and sent to serve Mongol needs. The elderly and children were turned out of the city without provisions. Contemporary sources record extensive looting. Everything of value was stripped from homes, workshops, and palaces. The great libraries were partially destroyed, partially preserved at Mongol discretion. Buildings were selectively burned to demonstrate Mongol power, while preserving enough infrastructure to make the city useful as an administrative center. But the real destruction of Samarkand wasn't physical. It was psychological and political. The capital of the Khwarazmian Empire had fallen in 5 days. Its Shah had fled before the siege even began. Its garrison had betrayed its Persian officers and been executed for their trouble. Every remaining city in the empire now understood with perfect clarity: resistance was futile, surrender was dangerous, and the only safe choice was to submit before the Mongols even arrived at your walls. Muhammad II was discovering that empires aren't just territory and armies, they're belief. And nobody believed in the Khwarazmian Empire anymore. While Samarkand burned, 2 Mongol generals named Jebe and Subutai were already riding west with 30,000 to 40,000 cavalry in pursuit of the fleeing Shah. The hunt for Muhammad would become a campaign unto itself, a chase across thousands of miles that would end on a desolate island in the Caspian Sea. But that was still months away. First, there were more cities to destroy. Jebe and Subutai weren't just generals. They were among Genghis Khan's most trusted and capable commanders, men who understood their Khan's strategic thinking so thoroughly they could operate independently for months with minimal direction. Contemporary sources record that Genghis Khan gave them a simple mission: pursue Shah Muhammad II wherever he fled, give him no rest, allow him no time to rally armies or organize resistance, and either capture or kill him. The force Genghis assigned them, estimates range from 30,000 to 40,000 cavalry, was large enough to crush any improvised defense Muhammad might organize, but small enough to maintain the speed necessary to run down a fleeing target. The pursuit covered thousands of miles across some of the most diverse terrain in Central Asia. Muhammad fled west from Samarkand in March 1220, heading toward the western provinces of his empire, where he hoped to find loyal forces and breathing room to regroup. But everywhere he went, Mongol scouts somehow arrived first. Jebe and Subutai's forces traveled faster than any contemporary Islamic army could match, 70 to 100 miles per day when necessary, rotating between multiple horses per warrior, carrying minimal supplies and living off the land when possible. They didn't fight every enemy force they encountered. They bypassed strong points. They maintained focus on their single objective: the Shah himself. Muhammad reached Nishapur on April 18th, 1220, according to contemporary sources. He spent a few weeks there, perhaps hoping the city's formidable walls would provide security while he assessed his options. But by mid-May, scouts reported that Mongol cavalry forces were approaching. Muhammad fled again. The Mongols arrived the day after he left, a pattern that would repeat throughout the pursuit. The Shah was being hunted with a precision that suggested the Mongols had better intelligence about his movements than his own commanders did. Silk Road merchants, local informants, captured couriers, every source of information fed into Mongol intelligence networks, and every day brought the hunters closer to their target. The pursuit itself served a strategic purpose beyond simply catching Muhammad. Every city the chase passed through witnessed their Shah fleeing for his life. Every population center saw Mongol cavalry arrive hot on his trail. The psychological impact was devastating. If the Shah couldn't stand and fight, if the ruler of 5 million people was reduced to running from city to city begging for sanctuary, why should anyone else resist? Contemporary accounts document cities and towns along the pursuit route that simply opened their gates to Mongol forces, calculating that submission was safer than defending a ruler who was clearly beaten. Historical records show that during the pursuit, Jebi and Subutai sacked the cities of Tus and Kazvin, killing significant portions of their populations. This wasn't random violence. This was demonstrating to Muhammad that his flight was costing his subjects their lives. Every day he ran, more people died. Every city that sheltered him, even briefly, faced Mongol retribution. The chase was military, psychological, and moral warfare combined. The Mongols were destroying Muhammad's authority with every mile he fled, turning him from a ruler into a refugee, from an emperor into prey. By late 1220, Muhammad had reached the southern coast of the Caspian Sea near the city of Abaskun. He had no army left, just a small band of loyal guards. He had no kingdom left. The Mongols controlled or were actively besieging every major city of his former empire. He was exhausted, demoralized, and sick. Contemporary sources record that on January 11th, 1221, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II died of pleurisy on a small island in the Caspian Sea, near Abaskun. The chroniclers describe him dying destitute. The ruler of 5 million people died with nothing but the clothes he wore and a handful of loyal servants. The man who had executed Mongol ambassadors, who had triggered this apocalyptic war through paranoia and pride, died alone on an island, hunted to his grave. He never rallied a significant army after Samarkand fell. He never won a single battle against the Mongols. He never even managed to slow them down. His flight and death demonstrated something that would echo through history. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies. They systematically dismantled the entire infrastructure of resistance. Kill the ruler. Destroy his armies. Burn his cities. Shatter his subjects' faith in his ability to protect them. By January 1221, the Khwarazmian Empire existed only in name. And the Mongols weren't finished. They would spend another year crushing the last pockets of resistance, and the methods they employed would make Bukhara and Samarkand's suffering look merciful by comparison. While Jebi and Subutai chased Muhammad to his grave, another siege was grinding through winter 1220 into early 1221. A siege that would test the Mongols like no other engagement in the campaign. Gurganj, also known as Gurganj, sat in the Amu Darya River Delta, surrounded by marshy terrain and canals that made conventional siege tactics nearly impossible. This was Muhammad's mother, Terken Khatun's home city, the place where she had ruled alongside her son in their uneasy diarchy. The garrison was loyal, well supplied, and commanded by officers who understood that the Mongol pattern of brutality meant surrender offered little safety anyway. They chose to fight. Genghis Khan assigned the siege to 3 of his sons, Yoki, Chagatai, and Ogedei. This would prove problematic. Historical sources document significant tension between Yochi and Chagatai, rivalry that went back to questions about Jochi's parentage and would poison Mongol politics for generations. Jochi wanted to preserve Gurganj relatively intact. He had been promised the western territories of the Khwarazmian Empire as his share of the conquest, and a destroyed capital was worth less than a functional one. Chagatai wanted the city annihilated, as an example. Ogadai, the third son, tried to mediate between his older brothers while actually running the siege operations. The terrain made everything harder. Gurganj sat among waterways, where Mongol cavalry maneuverability counted for nothing. The soft, marshy ground was too unstable for heavy siege engines. Stone projectiles sank into mud instead of smashing walls. The defenders could use boats to move supplies and reinforcements along canals, making complete encirclement difficult. Contemporary sources record this as the most difficult battle of the Mongol invasion of Khwarazm. Not because the garrison was particularly large or the fortifications particularly strong, but because the geographic conditions neutralized Mongol tactical advantages. The siege lasted 6 months, according to historical accounts, from late 1220 through early 1221. That's longer than any other engagement in the entire campaign, longer even than Otrar with its fanatical defense. The Mongols had to adapt their tactics, building causeways across marshes, using boats themselves to attack from waterways, essentially learning amphibious warfare on the fly. Chinese engineers, accustomed to siege warfare in dry northern China, had to improvise solutions for terrain they'd never encountered. Every approach to the walls turned into miserable fighting through mud and water. When the Mongols finally breached the walls in early 1221, the fighting turned into street-by-street urban combat. This wasn't the usual Mongol battle of movement and maneuver. This was house-to-house grinding warfare where every building had to be cleared. Every intersection had to be secured. Every block had to be taken individually. Contemporary accounts describe higher Mongol casualties than any other battle in the campaign. The defenders knew they faced annihilation, whether they surrendered or not. So they fought for every foot of ground, making the Mongols pay in blood for every advance. The final accounting of Gurganj's destruction comes from medieval sources that claim 1,200,000 people killed. Modern historians analyzing the demographics of the region and the physical constraints of the city itself agree this number is a massive exaggeration. The city simply couldn't have held that many people. Realistic estimates based on urban population densities of the era suggest tens of thousands killed, which is still a catastrophic loss, but not the apocalyptic figures Persian chroniclers recorded. The exaggeration itself tells us something. The destruction was so thorough, so brutal, that contemporaries struggled to find adequate numerical expression for the horror. Giovanni, chronicling the siege decades later, recorded that Genghis Khan ordered the city leveled and the land where it had stood flooded by diverting the Amu Darya River. Whether this literally happened or represents poetic expression of total destruction remains debated, but archaeological evidence shows that Gurganj was extensively damaged and partially abandoned after the siege. The city that Yaqut al-Hamawi had described in 1219 as greater and more beautiful than any he'd seen was reduced to broken walls and burned districts. The strategic lesson of Gurganj was clear. Even when geography favored defenders, even when terrain neutralized Mongol advantages, even when a garrison fought with desperate courage, the Mongols would still win. It would cost more. It would take longer. It would require adaptation and innovation. But the outcome was inevitable, and that inevitability was itself a weapon. Other cities watching Gurganj's 6-month death struggle had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even when everything went right for defenders, even when every advantage lay with the garrison, the Mongols still won. Still, one army was about to demonstrate that Mongol invincibility had limits. But first, The younger son of Genghis Khan had his own mission to accomplish, and the methods he employed in the Khorasan region would make even hardened Mongol veterans question whether there were any limits to the horror that military necessity could justify. February 1221. Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, received orders that seemed impossible on their face. Take 7,000 Mongol warriors, according to modern historian Karl Sverdrup's demographic analysis of the forces involved. Plus, whatever local conscripts could be pressed into service, and conquer Khorasan, a region containing multiple cities with populations exceeding 100,000 each, protected by garrisons that outnumbered his entire force. The mission wasn't just difficult, it appeared suicidal. But Tolui had advantages that garrison commanders sitting behind city walls couldn't match. He had mobility. He had psychological warfare refined to science. He had a reputation for brutality that preceded him. And he had a strategic insight that would turn every siege into a hostage situation. Historian J.A. Boyle, analyzing the Khorasan campaign's lasting impact, wrote that the region was conquered with thoroughness from which it never recovered. This wasn't hyperbole. Archaeological and demographic evidence shows that Khorasan's urban population didn't return to pre-Mongol levels for more than a century. Cities that had been commercial and cultural centers became provincial backwaters. Trade routes shifted away from devastated regions. The intellectual and cultural losses were incalculable. And it all began with Tolui's 7,000 warriors arriving at the gates of Merv. Merv, in 1221, was one of the largest cities in the world, the so-called Queen of Cities. Contemporary sources suggest a population comparable to Samarkand's, somewhere in the range of 100,000 residents, according to modern demographic analysis. Though Persian chroniclers claimed much higher numbers, the city sat along Silk Road routes and served as a center of Islamic learning, with 10 libraries, according to historical records, containing a total of 150,000 manuscripts. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to study in Merv's madrasas. Poets competed in its gardens. Merchants grew wealthy from trans-Asian trade. Tolui arrived on February 25, 1221. For 6 days, according to contemporary accounts, he surrounded the city and studied its defenses while his engineers assessed the fortifications. On the 7th day, he made his assault. But here's where Tolui's tactics departed from standard siege warfare. He didn't try to starve the city out or wear down its defenders through prolonged bombardment. Instead, he made an offer to the city's governor. Surrender now, and the population would be spared. Resist, and everyone dies. The governor opened the gates. Contemporary sources suggest the garrison and populace believed they could negotiate better treatment through submission than resistance. This had worked at some cities earlier in the campaign. Garrisons that surrendered early sometimes received relatively lenient treatment, with only the commanders executed and the population largely spared. But Merv had made one fatal miscalculation. They surrendered after other cities had demonstrated prolonged resistance. In Mongol logic, that meant Merv needed to serve as an example. What happened next appears in multiple contemporary chronicles, though the specific numbers are heavily disputed. Historical accounts claim between 700,000 and 1,300,000 people were killed. Modern historians analyzing the city's actual physical size and medieval urban population densities agree these figures are impossible. The city simply couldn't hold that many people. Realistic estimates suggest tens of thousands killed, with the city's population probably maxing out around 70,000. But even the lower numbers represent systematic massacre on a scale that horrified contemporaries. Juvaini recorded that the surviving citizens were divided among Mongol soldiers, each of whom received somewhere between 300 and 400 individuals to execute. Ibn al-Athir, the Arab chronicler, described the killings continuing for days. The libraries were burned, their manuscripts used as kindling or simply destroyed. 150,000 books according to contemporary records. Histories, scientific treatises, poetry, religious commentaries, astronomical observations went up in flames or were left to rot in ruined buildings. The queen of cities became the grave of cities. But Tolui wasn't finished. His 7,000 warriors had just demonstrated that even vast urban populations couldn't protect themselves against Mongol operational superiority and psychological warfare. The formula was simple and terrifying. Promise mercy for surrender, then demonstrate that mercy was a lie. Then watch every subsequent city face an impossible choice. Surrender and hope the Mongols are merciful this time, or resist and guarantee everyone dies fighting. Either way, Tolui won. He moved north toward his next target, leaving Merv a burned-out shell where dogs fed on corpses and the wind blew through empty streets. Nishapur was next. And what awaited Nishapur would be worse than anything Merv had suffered, because Nishapur had killed someone the Mongols loved. Nishapur had killed Tokuchar. Back in November 1220, during earlier fighting along the Khorasan frontier, a chance arrow fired from Nishapur's walls had struck Genghis Khan's son-in-law, Tokuchar, husband of one of the Khan's daughters. Contemporary sources don't record the tactical circumstances. Whether it was a lucky shot during an assault, a skilled archer making an impossible shot, or simply random chance in the chaos of siege warfare. What mattered was the result. Tokuchar died. His widow wanted revenge. And when the Mongol army finally returned to Nishapur in April 1221, revenge was exactly what they brought. The siege began on April 7th, according to contemporary chroniclers. The city's garrison knew what was coming. Survivors from Merv had spread stories of the massacre. Refugees from other fallen cities had described Mongol siege tactics. Everyone understood that Nishapur faced annihilation. But they also understood that surrender offered no safety. They chose to resist. Persian sources record that the defenders numbered about 12,000 archers, and they held out for 8 days, not long by medieval siege standards. But 8 days of desperate courage in the face of certain death. The equipment Tolui's forces deployed was staggering. Persian chroniclers report, though historians note these figures may be exaggerated like the casualty counts. 3,000 siege crossbows, 100 mangonels and ballistae, 1,000 scaling scaffolds, 4,000 siege ladders, and 1,700 naphtha throwers for hurling Greek fire. Whether exact or approximate, the scale was clearly massive. Chinese engineers had refined siege warfare into industrial-scale destruction. The walls of Nishapur faced bombardment from projectiles that weighed hundreds of pounds, from explosive devices that had never been seen in Central Asia before the Mongol invasion, from Greek fire that burned even when water was thrown on it. Historical accounts describe the final assault breaching the walls in over 70 locations simultaneously. This wasn't a single desperate push through one gate. This was overwhelming force applied at every point of defense, until the walls themselves became irrelevant. Mongol and conscripted assault troops poured through dozens of breaches at once. The defenders, already exhausted from 8 days of constant bombardment, couldn't possibly hold against such coordinated multi-point attacks. By April 10th, Mongol forces controlled the city. Then the real horror began. Tokuchar's widow personally supervised the massacre according to contemporary accounts. This detail appears in multiple sources and carries the ring of authenticity. Mongol women, especially those of royal blood, frequently held positions of authority and would absolutely have demanded direct oversight of vengeance killings. She wanted to ensure that her husband's death was avenged properly, that Nishapur suffered thoroughly, that the example would be so extreme that no other city would ever risk killing a Mongol of noble blood. The killing was systematic and total. Historical chronicles record that 400 craftsmen were spared, skilled workers whose abilities the Mongols valued. Everyone else died. Contemporary accounts describe the dead being separated into 3 groups for execution. Men, women, and children, killed separately, then their heads piled into 3 separate pyramids. Giovanni recorded that even cats and dogs were killed, that the site of Nishapur was leveled and sown with barley to erase any trace of habitation. The death toll Persian sources report is 1,747,000. This number is demographically impossible. Modern historians analyzing medieval urban population densities and Nishapur's physical size estimate the city's actual population was probably 100,000 to 200,000 at most. But the exaggeration itself tells us something about the psychological impact. Contemporary chroniclers, struggling to express the magnitude of horror, used impossible numbers because the reality was already so extreme that accuracy seemed beside the point. Nishapur didn't just die. It was erased with such thoroughness that the very numbers became mythological. The 3 pyramids of skulls served a specific purpose beyond satisfying Tokuchar's widow's need for vengeance. They were visible for miles, monuments to Mongol brutality that caravans and refugees would see from great distances. They were proof that resistance brought consequences worse than death in battle. They were advertising. Really, psychological warfare made physical, and the advertising worked. Contemporary accounts describe other cities in Khorasan surrendering without resistance after news of Nishapur's fate spread. Some populations fled into mountains before the Mongols even arrived, abandoning their cities entirely rather than face what Nishapur had faced. Tolui's mission in Khorasan was complete. 7,000 Mongol warriors had conquered a region of millions, systematically destroying its greatest cities, killing tens to hundreds of thousands, creating a reputation for brutality that would precede Mongol armies for generations. The thoroughness from which the region never recovered, in Boyle's phrase, was absolute. But while Tolui was erasing Khorasan from the map, something unexpected was happening in the eastern territories. Jalal al-Din, Muhammad's eldest son and only trusted commander, had gathered an army. And in September 1221, he would do something no Muslim army had done in this entire campaign. He would defeat the Mongols in open battle. The question was whether one victory could matter when everything else had already been lost. September 1221. Jalal al-Din Mingburnu stood at the head of 60,000 men, according to contemporary sources that for once show unusual consistency. 5 different chroniclers report similar numbers for the Khwarazmian force. These weren't garrison troops hiding behind walls. These weren't conscripted peasants. These were warriors who had chosen to fight one more time despite knowing the odds, despite watching every other army get crushed, despite having every rational reason to surrender or flee. They believed in Jalal al-Din, and he was about to prove their faith wasn't entirely misplaced. The Mongol commander was Shigi-Kutuk, Genghis Khan's adopted son and chief justice. He led somewhere between 30,000 and 45,000 Mongols, according to sources that vary more wildly than usual. This uncertainty probably reflects the fact that what happened next was embarrassing for Mongol chroniclers who had every reason to inflate the odds. Shigi-Kutuku was accomplished in administration and law, but he wasn't a battlefield commander. His experience was in organizing civil government, not in conducting mobile warfare against an enemy who understood Mongol tactics. The battlefield was a narrow valley near Parwan, terrain that was completely unsuitable for the mounted archery and sweeping cavalry maneuvers that gave Mongols their edge. The ground constrained movement. The valley walls prevented flanking. This was going to be dismounted infantry combat in many sections. Exactly the kind of warfare where Mongol advantages disappeared and Persian military tradition could compete. Jalal al-Din understood what he was doing. He'd chosen terrain that neutralized enemy strengths and maximized his own. The battle began with Mongol cavalry charges that should have broken the Khwarazmian lines. They didn't. Contemporary accounts describe fighting that lasted most of the day, with Jalal al-Din personally leading charges, rallying his men, demonstrating the kind of frontline leadership that his father Muhammad had never shown. The Khwarazmian troops held. They more than held. They pushed back. Historians analyzing the battle note this was dismounted fighting for the most part, with both sides forced by terrain to abandon mounted warfare and resort to melee combat with swords, maces, and hand-to-hand grappling. By evening, the Mongol army was retreating. Multiple contemporary sources document this explicitly. Ibn al-Athir, Juzjani, Juvaini all record that Shigi Kutuk lost over half his army in the engagement, with casualties estimated around 15,000 Mongols dead or seriously wounded. This was catastrophic. The Mongol army that had swept through the Khwarazmian Empire, crushing every enemy it faced, had just been defeated in open battle. The warriors who had seemed invincible were bleeding out in a Persian valley. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Jalal al-Din's men celebrated their victory by executing Mongol prisoners in ways calculated to send a message. Stakes were driven through the ears of captured warriors, a specifically degrading method of execution that demonstrated the victors weren't afraid to match Mongol brutality. The captured Mongol standards were paraded through the camp. Contemporary sources record that Jalal al-Din sent a taunting message to Genghis Khan. "In which locality do you want battle?" The tone was triumphant, confident, justified. They had done what everyone said was impossible. Historical analysis confirms that this was indeed the first defeat of the Mongols in a pitched battle against a Muslim opponent. Tactically, militarily, objectively, Jalal al-Din had won. His father Muhammad had fled without ever giving battle. Other commanders had surrendered or been crushed behind city walls. But Jalal al-Din had met the Mongols in open combat, on terrain of his choosing, and beaten them. For one evening, as his men celebrated and Mongol survivors limped away into the darkness, it seemed like the tide might finally turn. It seemed like maybe, just maybe, the Khwarazmian Empire could be rebuilt around this victory. Then the sun set, and in the camp of the victorious Khwarazmian army, an argument started over something absurdly trivial. A horse, a single white horse. The dispute would unravel everything Jalal al-Din had just accomplished in a matter of hours. Sometimes wars aren't lost on battlefields. They're lost in camps the night after victory, when exhausted men make stupid decisions over meaningless slights. What happened next at Parwan would demonstrate that the Mongols weren't the only ones who understood psychological warfare. Sometimes, you could defeat yourself more thoroughly than any enemy could manage. The argument began over spoils of war. Among the captured Mongol horses was a white stallion, a prized animal in Central Asian warfare, valuable both practically and symbolically. Two commanders wanted it. Amin Malik, Jalal al-Din's father-in-law and a senior commander in the Khwarezmian forces, claimed it as his right. Saif al-Din Igrak, an Afghan tribal leader whose forces formed a substantial portion of the army, disagreed. The specifics of their claims are lost to history. What matters is what happened next. According to contemporary accounts, Amin Malik struck Saif al-Din Igrak with a whip. This wasn't battle fury or momentary anger. This was deliberate insult. One commander publicly humiliating another over tribal and ethnic divisions that had been simmering beneath the surface of Jalal al-Din's coalition force. The Khwarazmian commanders, largely Persian in culture and Turkish by ethnicity, had always viewed the Afghan contingents as auxiliaries, as tribal barbarians useful in battle but subordinate in all other matters. Saif al-Din Igrak, his honor publicly attacked, made a decision that would doom thousands. That same night, according to multiple historical sources, 30,000 to 40,000 Afghan soldiers deserted. They left their campfires burning so the departure wouldn't be immediately noticed. They took their weapons, their horses, and their tribal pride, and they marched away from Jalal al-Din's army while he slept. When dawn broke and Jalal al-Din realized what had happened, his 60,000-man force had been reduced to 30,000 overnight. His great victory at Parwan suddenly looked a lot less decisive when he'd lost half his army to desertion. But the consequences went far beyond simple numbers. The cities that had rebelled against Mongol occupation after hearing about Jalal al-Din's victory at Parwan, Merv, Herat, and others according to contemporary sources, now faced Mongol retribution without the relief army they'd been counting on. When those cities rebelled, they'd calculated that Jalal al-Din's victorious force would arrive to support them, that the momentum had shifted, that the time for resistance had come. Instead, they'd committed themselves to doomed rebellions and would suffer massacres that made their initial occupations look gentle by comparison. Military historians analyzing the White Horse incident often focus on its demonstration of how fragile coalition warfare becomes when ethnic and tribal divisions exist beneath surface unity. Jalal al-Din had built his army from multiple groups who shared an enemy but didn't share trust, loyalty, or even basic respect for each other's honor codes. One insult was all it took to shatter the coalition. One whip strike destroyed what months of recruitment and training had built. Jalal al-Din now faced an impossible strategic situation. He had 30,000 men, still a significant force, but no longer enough to challenge the Mongols in another pitched battle. He was in Afghanistan, on the eastern edge of what had been his father's empire, with Mongol armies between him and the western territories where he might find reinforcements. Genghis Khan himself was now mobilizing forces to deal with this upstart prince who had dared to defeat a Mongol army and taunt the great Khan. The victory at Parwan, which should have been the turning point of the war, had become merely a delay in the inevitable. The only option was retreat. South toward India, toward territories outside direct Mongol control, toward the possibility of finding allies, or at least buying time to rebuild. Contemporary sources document that Jalal al-Din began a fighting withdrawal, his 30,000 men moving south while Mongol forces pursued and harassed them at every opportunity. It was February 1221 all over again. Another Khwarazmian ruler fleeing before Mongol armies. But unlike his father Muhammad, who had run without ever giving battle, Jalal al-Din had at least proven it was possible to defeat the Mongols. The question was whether that one victory mattered when everything else was falling apart. By November 1221, Jalal al-Din would reach the Indus River with Genghis Khan's main army at his back. And there, on the banks of that river, he would make his last stand. Whether it would be a glorious end or just another footnote in the Mongol conquest would depend on a single moment of desperate courage and a 30-foot leap that chroniclers on both sides would describe as miraculous. November 24th, 1221. Dawn broke over the east bank of the Indus River, where Jalal al-Din had arrayed his remaining 30,000 men for what everyone knew was the final battle. Behind them, the river. Ahead, Genghis Khan's main force, 50,000 warriors or more, according to contemporary estimates. To their left, a ridge of high ground that anchored their defensive line. To their right, more Mongol forces preventing any possibility of escape downstream. This wasn't going to be a running battle or a siege. This was going to be annihilation or miracle, with no middle ground between them. Jalal al-Din's deployment showed tactical sophistication even in a hopeless situation. He placed himself in the center with 5,000 men and 700 personal bodyguards, according to historical accounts. His father-in-law, Amin Malik, commanded the right wing. Afghan forces, perhaps the same warriors who had deserted after Parwan, or perhaps new recruits, held the left wing anchored against the ridge. The formation was sound, using terrain to protect one flank. Accepting that the river at their backs limited retreat options, but also prevented encirclement from behind. Positioning their best troops at the critical center where the heaviest fighting would occur. Genghis Khan personally commanded the Mongol forces. This wasn't a patrol action or a regional skirmish. This was the great Khan himself, the ruler of the Mongol Empire, taking the field against an enemy who had dared to defeat Mongol warriors at Parwan. The Mongols deployed in their standard crescent formation, with the wings extended to envelop the enemy flanks and reserves held back under Genghis Khan's direct command. The third son, Ogadai, commanded one of the forward divisions. The plan was simple: fix the Khwarazmian center, overlap the flanks, crush them against the river. The battle began at dawn, according to contemporary sources, and for a while, impossibly, the Khwarazmians held. Jalal al-Din's center drove back initial Mongol attacks. Ogadai's division was pushed back with casualties. The ridge protecting the left flank proved difficult for Mongol cavalry to assault. For a few hours, it looked like Parwan might repeat itself, like terrain and courage might overcome superior numbers one more time. But Genghis Khan hadn't personally commanded this battle to accept stalemate. A Mongol general named Belanoyan made the decisive move. Instead of continuing frontal assaults against the prepared Khwarazmian line, he led his division on a costly climb up the ridge that anchored Jalal al-Din's left flank. The climb was difficult. Steep terrain unsuitable for cavalry, defended by Afghan warriors who rolled stones down the slope and fired arrows at climbers. Contemporary sources don't record exact casualties, but modern military historians analyzing the terrain suggest the losses were significant. But when Belanoyan's forces finally reached the top of the ridge, they held the high ground and could attack down into the Khwarazmian left wing's flank and rear. The Afghan wing collapsed. Once again, according to historical accounts, tribal forces broke and fled when the tactical situation turned against them. Some fought their way along the riverbank, trying to escape. Others tried to swim the Indus and drowned in the current. With the left wing gone, the Khwarazmian center faced attack from three sides. Mongol forces to the front, Belanoyan's troops attacking from what had been the protected flank, and Genghis Khan's reserves now committing to exploit the breakthrough. Amin Malik, Jalal al-Din's father-in-law, who had started the White Horse disaster, was killed attempting to flee, according to contemporary sources. A fitting end for the man whose pride had destroyed the Parwan coalition. The Khwarazmian center disintegrated. Most of Jalal al-Din's army died fighting, were captured, or drowned trying to cross the river. The battle had turned from stalemate to massacre in the time it took Belanoyan to climb that ridge. Jalal al-Din found himself pressed back to the edge of a cliff above the Indus River. Below him, 30 feet down, according to sources that remarkably agree on the distance, the river flowed with current strong enough to drown armored men and horses. Behind him, Mongol warriors closing in to capture or kill the last defiant prince of the Khwarazmian Empire. Contemporary accounts from both Mongol and Persian chroniclers describe what happened next in almost identical terms. Jalal al-Din spurred his horse, charged toward the cliff edge, and jumped. 30 feet, wearing armor, on a horse that had been fighting all day, into a river with current powerful enough to sweep away strong swimmers. Multiple sources record that Genghis Khan, watching from a distance, saw the leap and spoke words that have echoed through history. Fortunate should be the father of such a son. The great Khan ordered his archers not to shoot at the swimming prince. Whether this was respect for courage, calculation that a heroic enemy death made better propaganda than a mundane execution, or simple awe at the audacity of the leap, Jalal al-Din survived. He swam across the Indus and escaped into India. Most of his followers weren't as lucky. Contemporary sources record that Mongol forces killed most of the captured soldiers and executed the commanders. But Jalal al-Din survived. The victory at Parwan, the White Horse disaster, the fighting retreat through Afghanistan, the last stand at the Indus. All of it ended with one man swimming a river while his army died behind him. This battle is recorded by historians as the concluding engagement of the Mongol invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire. Jalal al-Din would spend the next decade fighting various enemies across the Middle East before being killed by Kurdish bandits on August 15, 1231. His army lived on as a mercenary force called the Khwarazmian, fighting for whoever would pay them, until they were finally destroyed at the Battle of La Fourbi in 1246. The Mongols had conquered the Khwarazmian Empire. From the Otrar incident in 1218 to the Indus battle in November 1221, 3 years had reduced 5 million people from empire to refugees, from power to memory. The only question remaining was tallying the cost, and that accounting would prove as controversial as every other aspect of this brutal campaign. The numbers were staggering even before you questioned their accuracy. Medieval chronicles claim 2 million to 15 million deaths across the Mongol conquest of Khwarazm. Nishapur alone supposedly lost 1,747,000. Merv between 700,000 and 1,300,000. Gurganj 1,200,000. Contemporary sources recorded every major city producing casualty figures that seemed almost designed to break the imagination, to communicate horror so profound that mere counting became inadequate. Modern historians, analyzing medieval urban population densities and demographic constraints, tell a different story. Historian Karl Sverdrup's analysis of the region's demographics suggests most cities couldn't physically hold the populations chroniclers claimed they lost. Nishapur's realistic maximum population was probably 100,000 to 200,000. Merv, perhaps 70,000. Even if every single resident died, which archaeological evidence shows didn't happen, the numbers couldn't approach medieval claims. The consensus among contemporary scholars is that total deaths across the entire campaign were probably hundreds of thousands to low millions. Still catastrophic. Still one of the deadliest wars in medieval history. But not the apocalyptic 15 million some sources suggest. Historian Mikhail Biran offers an explanation for why Persian chroniclers used such extreme numbers. The speed with which the Mongols brought East Asian-style brutality to what had been a less ruthless Muslim world, she argues, caused cultural shock that demanded expression in impossibly large figures. When you'd never encountered systematic terror warfare before, when your entire understanding of civilized combat suddenly became obsolete. How could normal numbers convey what you'd experienced? The exaggeration wasn't dishonesty, it was trauma. The territory of the former Khwarazmian Empire was divided between what would become the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Chagatai Khanate in the northern territories. The Mongols installed administrators called Darugachi to manage military affairs and Baskak to handle taxation and civil government. These weren't puppet rulers. They were direct Mongol appointees who answered to Mongol Khans, transforming former imperial territories into provinces of a much larger empire. Rebellions flared in 1222 after the main Mongol armies withdrew. Cities that thought Mongol occupation was temporary. Populations that hoped the conquerors might be driven out. Commanders who tested whether Mongol military power could really reach everywhere. The Mongols returned and suppressed the rebellions with the same systematic brutality they'd employed during the initial conquest. Any illusion that resistance might succeed died with those rebellions. By 1223, Genghis Khan had returned to continue his campaign against the Jin dynasty in China, leaving the frontier between the Mongol Empire and the surviving Islamic world set at the Amu Darya River. But the campaign's true legacy wasn't measured in territory or casualty figures. It was measured in what became possible afterward. The Mongol conquest of Khwarazm served as the platform for subsequent invasions of Georgia, Persia, and eventually Baghdad in 1258. The same generals who had destroyed Samarkand and Nishapur, Jebe and Subutai, went on to invade Russia and Eastern Europe using identical tactics. The intelligence networks established during the Khwarazmian campaign remained active. The psychological impact of Mongol brutality preceded their armies into every subsequent campaign. One war in Central Asia established patterns that would reshape Eurasian politics for the next century. Three things about the Khwarazmian conquest revolutionized warfare beyond the immediate military victories. First, psychological warfare became a strategic weapon rather than a battlefield tactic. The Mongols proved you could win wars by reputation, by making enemies too terrified to fight effectively. Second, intelligence-driven operations showed that information superiority could overcome numerical disadvantages. The Silk Road spy networks that mapped Khwarazmian weaknesses were as important as the cavalry that exploited them. Third, adaptive logistics demonstrated that supposedly impossible maneuvers became possible with sufficient preparation. That 300-mile desert crossing turned geographic assumptions into tactical advantages. Modern military academies still study the campaign. The three-pronged convergence on Samarkand demonstrates coordinated operations across vast distances. The desert flanking maneuver shows how intelligence and boldness can negate defensive geography. Tolui's conquest of Khorasan with 7,000 men illustrates force multiplication through psychological operations. These aren't historical curiosities. These are case studies in operational art that remain relevant 8 centuries later. The raw numbers, even the conservative ones, demand perspective. Hundreds of thousands to low millions killed in approximately 2 years makes this campaign comparable to the 30 Years' War, compressed into 24 months. The highest population density regions of Central Asia lost substantial portions of their urban populations. Trade routes shifted. Cultural centers disappeared. The intellectual losses, libraries burned, scholars killed. Astronomical instruments destroyed, set back Islamic science in ways that are still being calculated. What made this war different from other medieval campaigns wasn't just the brutality. Plenty of medieval wars were brutal. It was the personal trigger combined with systematic execution. The Otrar incident, the execution of merchants and ambassadors, set off a cascade that Genghis Khan's philosophy of Achi Kari Ulku demanded be pursued to total conclusion. This wasn't strategic necessity alone. This was vengeance that happened to align with strategic advantage. The Mongols demonstrated to the Islamic world that executing ambassadors brought consequences beyond normal warfare, that cultural assumptions about diplomatic immunity weren't universal, that the rules of civilized combat varied dangerously across civilizations. The pattern established in Khwarazm became the template for westward expansion. The same generals, the same tactics, the same psychological warfare would be deployed against Russian princes, Polish knights, Hungarian armies. Each subsequent campaign built on lessons learned destroying the Khwarazmian Empire. Each new enemy faced warriors who had already perfected their craft on Persian cities. The efficiency only increased. In 1219, the Khwarazmian Empire was one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of China. By 1221, it was a geographic expression, a former empire whose territories were being divided between Mongol princes. The transformation took 24 months. The destruction of a century-old empire in 2 years wasn't just military victory, it was historical erasure. One question remains unanswerable, but unavoidable. Could Muhammad II have won if he'd made different choices? If he'd trusted his commanders and concentrated his forces into a unified field army instead of scattering them in city garrisons? If he'd met the Mongols in open battle on terrain of his choosing rather than ceding them operational freedom? If he'd never executed those ambassadors in the first place? If diplomatic channels had remained open? Contemporary sources and modern historians offer no consensus. Some argue the Mongol military superiority was too great, that organizational and tactical advantages would have overcome any strategy. Others suggest that concentrated Khwarazmian forces fighting defensively on favorable terrain might have inflicted enough casualties to make the campaign too costly, that Genghis Khan might have accepted negotiated settlement rather than endless siege warfare. We'll never know. What we do know is what happened. An empire of 5 million people disappeared in 2 years. Hundreds of thousands to millions died. Cities that had stood for centuries were systematically destroyed. Trade routes shifted. Cultural centers vanished. And all of it traces back to one diplomatic incident, one execution, one ruler's catastrophic miscalculation about how an enemy would respond to insult. The Mongol conquest of the Khwarazmian Empire proved that in war, it's not always the largest army that wins. Sometimes it's the army with better intelligence, superior logistics, coordinated strategy, and absolute commitment to psychological dominance. Sometimes it's the army willing to cross deserts others consider impassable, to maintain operational focus across thousands of miles, to treat terror as a weapon as important as bows and horses. Sometimes it's the army commanded by a leader who understands that killing one merchant caravan requires killing one empire in response, because Anshikari Ulku, good for good, evil for evil, isn't negotiable. The Khwarazmian Empire learned that lesson. The cities of Central Asia paid the tuition, and the cost was calculated in hundreds of thousands of lives, dozens of destroyed cities, and 2 years that changed medieval history forever.